friends, I'm Josef. This is the Catacombic Machine podcast. Today, you'll get to listen to a conversation between Aaron van Voorhis and myself about his book, A Survival Guide for Heretics. Aaron is a radical theologian inspired by Tad DeLay and Peter Rollins and other radical theologians, but he is also a pastor. He is in a community practicing radical theology, which I think makes him extra interesting. And not only that, his background as a fundamentalist Christian is interesting as well. So I hope that you will enjoy that. Before we get started, I just want to say for people in Sweden, April 21st and 22nd, I'll host an event in Gothenburg called Catacomb. Some of Sweden's most interesting and thought-provoking theologians will be there. Ola Sigurdsson, Petra Karlsson, Sofia Kamrin, Jonathan Beckerli, Ludwig Lindelöf, and the ethnologist, the outsider I guess, Eddie Nels, he's been on the podcast. He'll be there too, talking about the church in the age of the internet. And May 20th, Barry Taylor and I will be in Utrecht in Holland to talk about radical theology. So, if you're in Holland or if you're close, you should go there and visit us and hang out and talk. We'll have a good time. Alright, so that's a short intro, but it's enough. Let's get going. This is Aaron van Voorhis.
Yeah, so I was born and raised to a very fundamentalist Pentecostal family. My parents became Christians in San Francisco during the 1970s, which is sort of the Jesus people movement, if you're familiar with spiritual movements in America. So I was born to this very rigid, moralistic, but also hyper-spiritual. I would describe them as hyper-Pentecostal. Meaning they were obsessed with the end times, obsessed with eschatology, obsessed with demonology. For my father, angels and demons controlled everything. So if something good happened to you in your life, it was because God somehow intervened or there was an angel present that made it happen. If something bad happened, if you got sick or if you got into a car accident, this was demonic. This was evidence of the demonic. It was pretty scary to be raised in that kind of a worldview as a young child, being told that you have everything to fear. The world is dangerous because it's full of demons. And if you sin, God is going to remove his protective umbrella, his spiritual, supernatural umbrella of protection over you and allow Satan to attack you, to teach you a lesson, to draw you back to him. So we were told anytime we got sick with a cold, my dad would go into his bedroom and pray and ask God, why is Aaron sick? And then he would come tell me, Aaron, God told me that you became ill because you've been rebellious and disobedient around the house lately. You need to ask for forgiveness. I remember one time I was in my bedroom listening to Stryper. If you remember that 80s Christian rock band Stryper? Yeah, okay. So I was listening to Stryper in my bedroom as I was off to do when I was 12. And I was listening to this song, To Hell with the Devil. If you're familiar with that song, off of, I forget what album of theirs, but To Hell with the Devil is one of their songs, which was pretty edgy for even Christian rock to say to hell with something, even if it's the devil, it was kind of edgy. So I'm in my bedroom listening to that song, and all of a sudden my dad kicks the door open and he says, the oven just broke. And it's because that song was playing, and that song has curse words in it, and you invited a demon to this house with that song. That was the kind of world I grew up in. And it was pretty damn scary. And my father is mentally ill, okay? But I didn't know that until I was 20-something. And when I say he's mentally ill, I'd say he hits 8 out of 9 criteria for schizotypalism, which is kind of like diet schizophrenia or schizophrenia light. And I don't mean to make fun of any kind of mental illness. I don't mean it like that. I just mean to describe it in a way that maybe everybody can understand. It's almost like schizophrenia, but it's high-functioning schizotypalism, I guess is the right way to put it, which means he has magical thinking. He'll hear a voice every now and then and think it's God. He thinks he has special powers. He really sees the world as this spiritual battlefield. And I would say he's had both auditory and visual hallucinations that he chalks up to supernatural experiences. So it was a pretty damn scary childhood. And I have 2 younger brothers and an older sister, and we all had panic attacks. I mentioned this in my book, how I would wake up every night for years in the middle of the night because my brother was in the bunk bed below me, and he'd be praying in tongues out loud in the middle of the night because he'd be terrified. He'd be experiencing this kind of demonic attack. He would start feeling nauseous or something, and he would think it was the devil who's attacking him. My other brother spent, I would say, 8 years in my parents' bedroom floor every night. He would, even up till he was like 15, I think, he would take the cushions off the couch in the living room and put them out on my parents' bedroom floor at the foot of their bed, and he would sleep in there every single night for about 8 years, from like 7 to 15, because we were so scared of it sounds funny to say, we were scared of the dark. We were scared of night because that's when my father made us think that that's when attacks happen more often in his worldview. I don't quite understand it even now, but that's what it's like being raised by a mentally ill father, but also what it's like being raised by a father who is obsessed with Pentecostalism and takes things to this, essentially to their conclusion. I mean, if you really believe in what Pentecostalism teaches, you're going to be crazy.
But I mean, most people invent some way to cope with that because we don't really believe in whatever teaching that the pastor is telling us. So if you're sick, you go to the hospital.
Right. We did not do that. Anytime we ever had to go to the doctor for like an annual shot that the school demanded or required that we have, it was always kind of a battle with my dad because he firmly believed that you only use medicine or go to the doctor if you don't have faith, that using medicine was a sign of unbelief. And in those kinds of churches, keep in mind that mental illness hides in a lot of people. I mean, I knew a lot of people growing up that, looking back at it now, had serious personality disorders or psychosis. But in the charismatic Pentecostal churches, that stuff can hide and simply be branded as spirituality, faithfulness, right? And I like what you said about how a lot of people don't have that experience, even if they grew up in the Pentecostal church. I mean, my friends didn't have fathers like mine. My friends had more normal upbringings and went to college and things. But you're right. I think it really comes down to my dad really believed this stuff. And for me, what actually got me out of it, as Rollins talks about, really believe your beliefs. Really believe your beliefs so that they can crack open and that you can really realize what they are and really confront your unbelief. Really believe your beliefs so that you can realize you don't really believe what you think you believe. Really try to believe that if you just have enough faith, God's going to intervene and heal you. Really try to believe that.
Or not at all.
Or not at all.
Right? Because I think that's the problem for most people who are raised in conservative churches, at least evangelical, the types that I know. People have quite firm beliefs in certain areas like demonology, you talked about that, eschatology, end times, the Bible, of course, the Bible being the inerrant word of God and so on.
It was a book of magic, yeah.
Yeah. When you have those firm beliefs, you create a way to move around it when you need to. And that's why people oftentimes can stay.
Sure.
Because if they actually followed through, they would realize this is bullshit.
Right.
Or they would actually just go crazy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so when people confront me from my past, like my family or an old friend, and they find out where I'm at now with my faith or my journey, and they say, wow, you've really gone off the deep end. You really lost your faith. And I like to respond and say, no, the problem isn't that I didn't believe enough. The problem is that I believed too much. The problem is I really believe what my father taught me. In my teens and early 20s, I really tried believing it. I was deeply committed. I was the kid that brought everybody to church and got them saved out of his school. Not everybody, but all my friends. I mean, I was known as the kid who was like the evangelist and the pastor in the making. The problem is I really believed that stuff, and it broke me. And I realized that this is bullshit. And this is a way of, it's catharsis. It's a way of covering up existential dread and the pain and the suffering of life. Now that I know more about my father's upbringing, what happened to him, and the trauma he experienced as a young man, the church and Pentecostalism was a total escape. It was an alternate reality that he constructed in order to avoid himself, in order to avoid what happened. So, yeah, that's what I had to come to realize, and that was a deconstructive radical theology event, apocalyptic.
And so would you say that what you're up to now is sort of coming to terms with what happened, or trying to understand it, or have you moved even further away from that?
I feel like the answer is yes. What I'm doing now is a part of a response to that, of course, but I also mean yes, that I've moved away from it and moved beyond it now, in the sense that I feel like it's more than just a response. I'm not doing this because I'm angry with my father. I'm doing this because I still identify as a Christian, and I'm deeply moved by what the church represents. And I'm deeply moved by the story of Jesus of Nazareth. And I'm a pastor of a Christian church. So if I really wanted to say, fuck you, Dad, I just wouldn't even be a Christian anymore. So it's not about being mad with my father. I've since reconciled with him to a great degree. He and I don't talk much, but when we do, it's nice. But, it's more about, for me, helping others who had less extreme upbringings, but still traumatic experiences with fundamentalism, get sober from the drug of fundamentalism, get sober, as Peter talks about a lot, from this violent and oppressive deity who provides certainty and satisfaction, who allows us to cover up the truth of our lives. That's what I'm about. That's what ministry looks like for me right now.
It's fun though you say certainty and satisfaction, because you're brought up with this, and it didn't seem to give you either of them.
No, it totally did at the time. I found myself, I remember in high school describing myself as like one of God's special forces. I described myself as this elite, like Green Beret, Navy SEAL warrior for God. That gave me a very strong elitist mentality, a very strong identity, the very strong tribalistic way of looking at things, like us and them. So I derived an enormous amount of certainty and satisfaction from my Pentecostal roots. Enormous amount.
Okay. So why didn't you leave? At some point you must have come to sort of a fork in the road where you think, I can't do this no more. So why stay at all? Why even become a pastor? You didn't just... Some people might still go to church and play the game because of social reasons or whatever. But you actually went into ministry. So how did that play out?
It played out over the course of about 10 years, where I did leave the church for a while. I didn't attend church for the better part of a year when I first started seminary, because I was so burnt out by my first full-time job working for a church. Right after I got my BA in biblical studies, I worked full-time for a church in Nashville, Tennessee, a fundamentalist, kind of a neo-fundamentalist, non-denominational megachurch in the making. And I was the ministry assistant, and that meant that I was sort of the catch-all. I did a lot of different things, but the pastor was this heavy-handed, hyper-pragmatic CEO-type pastor, obsessed with attendance, building, and cash, and didn't really emotionally connect with others, sort of a sociopath, really. And I left that 2.5-year gig feeling totally burnt out. And so when I went to Fuller, my wife and I didn't attend church for a year because we just felt like we needed to decompress. And I was really questioning whether or not I belonged in ministry at that point. I was thinking about going on and getting a PhD and just getting into academics. And at the end, when I graduated from Fuller, I thought about going to Scotland and getting a PhD. But this opportunity presented itself in the town next door to Pasadena, where Fuller is, in Glendale, where this church was dying, and they were looking for a new pastor to come in and change everything. And one of my professors at Fuller said, it's really hard to get into academics, even if you go to a top-tier school. If you have any drive whatsoever to be in pastoral ministry, I'd say do that. And I said, well, okay, this church is looking for a pastor. I'll interview. They want to change everything. They want to cut their ties with the Southern Baptists. I'm not Southern Baptist. No interest in maintaining any kind of fundamentalist structure. So I interviewed and I got the job, and I got the job with the mandate to come in and change everything. And that's what we did. We cut our ties with the Southern Baptists. We built the church on this intellectually honest vision. We wanted to build a community around the value of intellectual honesty, about science, about questioning God, questioning things about our faith. And so That was 2009. In 2013, I encountered the work of Peter Rollins for the first time, and it was like a lightning strike. I said to myself, this is everything I've been trying to say but haven't been able to articulate. I read The Idolatry God in 24 hours, and it completely changed how I preached. I began deconstructing everything. I became this I didn't even know how to describe it, this radical theologian, I guess, who blurred the lines between theism and atheism every Sunday. And I was already questioning biblical inerrantist. I already wasn't a biblical inerrantist, but I began questioning it more and actually like owning up to all my doubts in the pulpit. Then that was 2014. That's when I really made the shift into radical theology, when I began to acknowledge that I don't believe in the resurrection. I don't believe in a supreme being God, but more of like Tillich's grounded being. But I don't even believe in any kind of certainty. It's more of like, for me, God is found in the simple act of love itself, as Rollins and Caputo would say. So I'm trying to compress a lot right now, Josef. That's the journey. That's kind of what's happened over the last 10 years. So it was a slow burn, leaving the fundamentalist Pentecostal roots. But basically, the reason why that happened is because I went and studied the Bible at the academic level, both in undergraduate and graduate. And it kind of led me into this dying church that wanted to hire somebody to come in and change everything. So that's how I ended up here.
So how was it received in the church? I mean, if they were Southern Baptists and suddenly,
right.
They have this realization, we need to change things. We can't keep doing this. But I mean, at the same time, I assume they weren't open for whatever was other than Southern Baptist theology. So can we walk us through a little bit how the theology that you were preaching when you were blurring the line between atheism and theism, how was that received? Were people angry? Were they scared? Were they feeling insecure? Did they love it?
So when I was hired in 2009 to come in and lead this transition out of the Southern Baptist denomination, I was not hired as this radical theologian. I wasn't there yet myself with radical theology. I was just more or less somebody who questioned his faith and was a theistic evolutionist, and I just wanted to build what I would call an intellectually honest Christian community. So they knew that about me, and that's where they were at too with their own faith, you could say. So there was no anger. But what happened was so there was about 25 people. Sorry if you hear my dogs whining when I'm talking. The UPS man just arrived. So if you hear some barking, that's what's going on. So when I was hired, there's about 25 people left in the church. And they basically, again, hired me to lead this church through the transition, not knowing fully what that meant, and neither did I. But so all that to say, over the 2.5 years, the first 2.5 years, they all left. They got disappointed with what I was doing because it didn't cause the church to grow that much. We went from 25 to 45 in 3 years, and they got really disappointed and they started leaving.
In Sweden, you would be considered a mega church.
So that's what I was telling them. I said, in Sweden, this would be like a mega church. No, I said to them,
yes.
I said to them, this is what it looks like to do ministry in a post-church, post-Christian culture of Los Angeles. But they were having none of it. They started blaming my sermons, saying, your sermons aren't good enough. That's why nobody's coming. Max's worship leading, that's not good enough. That's why people aren't coming. They got disappointed. And so that original 25 that hired me left because it just didn't explode in growth. But that was the best thing that could have happened, because when they left, my handlers left, and I was really free to be myself. Because up until that point, I kind of felt managed by them. And when they left, I felt free to experiment and really to come into my own. And that's when I started going more and more to the left, more and more to the left theologically and politically, I guess you could say. And it was then that I encountered Peter Rollins' work, and it's then that I began to be very open about the fact that I'm affirming of LGBT people. And the rest of the church at that time, the people who had started coming to the church were also very progressive, and they had this vision of building an intellectually honest Christian community. And when I started saying things like, I don't know if God exists, maybe that's not a very interesting question. Let's really talk about what it means to affirm life. Let's really talk about what it means to find depth, infinite depth and love in life itself. people started saying, yeah, that makes sense to me. I really like that. Let's, when I start talking about how we should identify with Christ on the cross when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That this is the quintessential Christian experience, undergoing the death of God, the loss of all meaning, the loss of identity that you find in a religion. And by experiencing that, we can have a resurrection where we find God in this kind of, again, infinite depth of love and life itself. God present in the sufferings, in the successes and joys and the failures and brokenness, right? So when I started saying things like that, starting in 2014, people started really agreeing with it and liking it because they were already sort of in a progressive place. But we continued going down that road, and some people have left because they just cannot get on board with the idea that their pastor doesn't really believe in God, like a supreme being, or questions the existence of all gods, and only is loosely perhaps a theist on a very simple level or a very vague level. I don't know what I am anymore. I don't know what I believe anymore. I like what Rollins says. I believe I don't know what I believe. This is the truth. And to be frank, I never really did. This idea that I really knew that God existed in my childhood. Come on, I was fooling myself, of course. So, but I feel like I'm more of a Christian now than I was then. I feel like I'm more committed to participating in the cross and the resurrection now than I was then, when it was all magic and voodoo. Now, for me, it's about finding Christ and the meaning of Christianity in the simple act of love itself and life itself. So that transition, I lost a lot of people during that transition, but I gained a lot more. And most of my church, I would say, would identify as post-evangelical, and some would even identify as post-Christian. They wouldn't even own the title Christian. I still own the title Christian because it's like my last name is Van Voorhis. I love being a Van Voorhis. Being a Van Voorhis is really cool. There's some really nice things that come with that. Same thing for Christianity. I still really love what Christianity aspires to be and who Jesus of Nazareth was. I still really identify with his core teaching. So yeah, I mean that's the community we've built, and that's kind of that's what we've been through.
Yeah, and I'm sure the people who left went to some place where someone could tell them the truth, so they're good too.
Right? Yeah, they're fine. They're not.
They're fine. Okay, so in your book you write about these 4 stages, moving from a sort of naive faith towards mysticism. So maybe you can outline that. And we've talked about your personal journey, but if you want to, feel free to connect your own experiences to the various stages.
Sure. So those stages aren't my stages. Those belong to Morgan Scott Peck, now deceased Christian psychologist from the 1980s, who during his practice discovered that many Christians go through these 4 stages of spiritual development or spiritual journey: chaos, fundamentalism, skepticism, mysticism. Chaos, fundamentalism, skepticism, mysticism. And basically, just to sum those up, chaos meaning sort of existential dread, existential angst, ontic shock, as Rollins would describe it, right? The sense that life is meaningless, death is inevitable, we're all broken, nobody knows shit. And I could die in the next moment from a number of things, right? And then we try to cope with that kind of chaos with religious fundamentalism, perhaps. People turn to religion as an escape mechanism for these truths, someone who's going to provide them with certainty and satisfaction and answers and meaning, and give them a worldview that will essentially help them cover up the ontic shock and the existential dread. But as you're in fundamentalism, years and years go by, perhaps you begin to question the belief system because it's so rigid and it's so neat and clean, and life just isn't like that. And so you become a skeptic. You begin deconstructing your beliefs, right? And then you can kind of take a fork. So you can go from skepticism back into fundamentalism, or you can go from skepticism into atheism and say, fuck the church, fuck religion, it's all bullshit. Or you can go into mysticism, which is kind of where I've ended up in my community, where we kind of acknowledge that we're atheists, that we all have this atheist within us, but that we also are deeply committed to spirituality at some level. For a lot of us, we still hold on to the hope of the afterlife. We still believe that there is some kind of I don't know, this kind of, if you want to call it, a supernatural consciousness that might be animating the universe as this incredible, ordered and beautiful place. That might be possible. So we see ourselves as embodying spirituality still. We believe that human beings have this transcendent aspect to them that can be best expressed in the language of religion. Religion is no longer about voodoo and magic for us, but about a language of the soul, an expression of the ineffable, right? Theological language is vocabulary for words we don't have, really. So that's kind of the mysticism, and that's kind of the journey. And you said, share kind of my own journey in those 4 stages. In the book, I talk about how I never really had a stage 1 chaos because I was born in the church. I was born into stage 2 fundamentalism, but then I definitely went through skepticism when I went away to college and left home and began hearing different points of view. And then over about 10 years, got into mysticism, you could say. But again, it's not mysticism in the sense of following the Grateful Dead around or playing with crystals. It's really about, again, this radical theology experience of finding depth and perhaps even the presence of God, so to speak, in life and love itself.
So when you went through this idea of skepticism, did it all fall at the same time, or did you have certain areas of your worldview that started to collapse and then a domino effect?
Yeah, the trouble started when I lost biblical inerrancy.
So beware, all fundamentalists.
So, yeah, biblical inerrancy is the first domino that has to go. And I'm not just saying for myself, I'm saying in my experience as a pastor, once that seems to me the biggest obstacle for somebody being able to let go of their fundamentalism is biblical inerrancy. Once the Bible is no longer a book of magic, you can move on in life. So once, I lost biblical inerrancy in probably at Fuller in 2006 is when I really came to terms with the fact that I no longer held the Bible as inerrant. And when that happened, I began to question everything. So, yeah.
Okay, so when you talk about laying down these identities, slave or free, male or female, and so on, some would say that's a problematic statement because there's too many people being sort of defined by an oppressive system as slaves, for example.
So a couple of things there. Number one is when we say and echo Paul in Galatians, there is no longer slave or free, male or female, Jew or Greek, and we take the end of those social, political, sexual binaries and we apply them across the board and say there's no longer gay or straight, there's no longer black or white, there's no longer Democrat or Republican, there's no longer atheist or theist. We don't mean to say that those identities no longer exist. They absolutely do. I am a white straight male. I am an American, I still am those things. However, when we say that there's no longer these binaries, we're saying that something transcends those binaries, meaning our shared humanity. That's what I mean. We have a greater identity that transcends those simplistic political, social, sexual, whatever you want to call them, identity markers, systems of meaning, and that is essentially our shared humanity. That's what transcends all that. And for me, that is the foundation of this kind of quote unquote Christian mysticism. And that's where justice comes in, because ultimately the mysticism I'm describing, as I've said already, is about locating infinite depth in love itself, infinite depth in love. And when I mean love, I don't mean like a warm feeling towards, somebody. I mean a lifestyle. I'm talking about action. I'm talking about justice. I'm talking about empathy. I'm talking about truth. So when I'm talking about mysticism, I'm talking about a deep commitment to fully investing ourselves in the world, fully investing ourselves in loving action, in justice, because otherwise it's all bullshit. It's just, coffee house banter and it's just philosophizing with your friends at the local bar. It's all just, that's not what mysticism is. That's ultimately not what the project of radical theology is about. It's about a way of living in the world. It's about finding depth in the simple acts of love, justice, and empathy. This is what it's about. So when you ask what does justice have to do with mysticism, it has everything to do with it. It is everything. It's absolutely everything. Otherwise, it's all bullshit. So so that's what I would say to somebody who is not just considers themselves marginalized, but is marginalized, like the African American or the LGBT person, that their identity absolutely matters in this context. Without question, it matters. However, the way it matters is the way that we treat them as human beings. We humanize them. That's the greater identity. We are all human. That's the real power of it. When we say we transcend these tribalistic, entities or identities.
I think we can problematize that a little bit from a radical theological perspective, that there is this transcendent sort of unity, we're all humans or something. I would rather speak about affirming everyone's difference or something like that.
They have these differences. They have uniqueness. That's part of what it means to be human.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, but there is always a risk in those kinds of reasonings that you end up with the sort of normative identity of what it means to be human anyway.
Absolutely.
So the loss of certainty, does that make it harder to unify in a cause for, say, whatever?
I don't feel that way at all. My experience is that we've exchanged certainty for a calling towards radical inclusion of the other, radical inclusion of different ideas, and the values of justice, empathy, and truth. So certainty, I use the analogy of choosing to run your car on dirty energy or clean energy. When you run your car on dirty energy like gasoline, it produces dangerous emissions that harm people. When you run the church on dirty energies like certainty, tribalism, these kinds of things, it creates dangerous emissions of violence and intolerance and bigotry and oppression, right? But if you run the church on the clean energy of empathy, truth, radical inclusion, skepticism, then suddenly you produce wonderful emissions like, again, empathy, these kinds of things. So for me, there is no loss of I want to say, passion within my community to go out and change the world. In fact, I think it's been enhanced because we see ourselves as kind of a radical community of Christians that have gone beyond faith and are practicing this way of Christ in the world, which is, again, love, right? So
exemplify a little bit, because you're a practitioner. The most people that I talk to on this podcast, they're theoreticians. They're at the university. You're talking about Pete at times. I guess he is not at the university, but most people who are doing radical theology and who are in some ways sort of writing about it, talking about it, they're at the university. So give us a few examples for how this plays out practically in your congregations.
Sure. So I'll give you an example of what's taking place just this weekend. So starting last Sunday and happening this Sunday and next Sunday, we're doing this 3-part series called Voorhis. Last Sunday, we had someone come in, an expert on child sex trafficking, and she came in and spoke during our Sunday service about that and how we can partner with her organization and be more aware of what's going on in our communities with sex trafficking. This Sunday, we're having a transgender woman come in and talk specifically about being transgender in the church and the struggles that she's faced and what it means for her to be a transgender Latina who is getting her Mastery of Divinity in the Lutheran tradition and has encountered enormous amounts of bigotry and intolerance, but has moved beyond it and loves the church. Next Sunday, we're having a man come in, a friend of the church from Manhattan, New York, to talk specifically about racism. So he does performance art called Words on White, where he's going to do a dramatic presentation along with about half a dozen other actors specifically talking about racism, specifically about Black Lives Matter. So there you go. There's a 3-part series we're doing right now that's all about understanding, some of the hardest political and social issues in our culture right now. But I would say all the time, every week, we're talking about some kind of social action that we're doing as a community. So it's not just about what's happening on Sunday mornings. We're constantly trying to mobilize ourselves to raise money, raise goods, raise material for Syrian refugees in San Diego. We just filled up a 14-foot truck for that. And we just we're partnering with homeless shelters. We're constantly doing some kind of major social initiative in the greater Los Angeles area. It's not just a little part of who we are. It's a lot of who we are. So I would say that's a big example for you, Josef.
Okay, so Aaron, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on.